In the late 1800s, paleontologists began pulling something out of the ground that no one could explain. It wasn't a bone, it wasn't a jaw, it wasn't anything they had seen before. It was a spiral, a tight, perfect, continuous coil of teeth, dozens of them, locked together in a curve that never broke, never reset, and kept going deeper the longer you looked at it. No skull, no body, no context, just the spiral. And the teeth weren't scattered. They were arranged with a precision that looked almost deliberate, like something had designed them that way. Each new tooth formed at the center and pushed the older ones outward, tightening the coil as the animal grew. No living shark does this. No living anything does this. Scientists were baffled. Some thought the spiral ran along the creature's back like a fin. Others imagined it jutting out from the nose as a weapon. A few believed it had to be inside the mouth, but couldn't figure out how any animal could actually use it to eat. Even within ancient oceans that supported complex ecosystems, this design stood apart. It did not resemble adaptation. It resembled a contradiction. For over 100 years, no one agreed. The same fossils kept turning up in different parts of the world, separated by oceans and millions of years, and every single one carried the same unanswered question: what was this thing? Because here's what made it truly strange. This wasn't a failed design. This animal survived. It thrived. It ruled ancient seas for nearly 30 million years. So how does a creature with a structure no one can explain become one of the most successful predators the ocean has ever seen? Today, we follow the mystery of the Buzzsaw shark that ruled prehistoric seas. Long before the spiral was ever uncovered and turned slowly in human hands, the waters that carried it moved with a steadiness that shaped entire worlds. Across the surface of the planet, seas stretched wide and uninterrupted, spreading into vast shallow basins that held warmth close and light within reach. Continents had gathered into a single immense landmass, and along its edges, the ocean pressed inward, forming broad shelves where life gathered in quiet abundance. These Permian seas did not resemble the oceans known today. Their chemistry carried different balances. Their currents followed unfamiliar paths, and the air above them held a composition that subtly altered the exchange between sky and water. Oxygen moved through these environments in patterns that supported dense networks of life, allowing organisms to occupy layers of the water column with a kind of quiet certainty. There was no sense of scarcity pressing against every movement. Instead, stability settled into the system, creating conditions where complexity could take hold and remain. Within these shallow expanses, ecosystems unfolded with a measured richness. Fish of many forms moved through open water, some armored, others streamlined, each adapted to a role that fit within the larger rhythm. Early cephalopods drifted and pulsed, their soft bodies guided by buoyancy and gentle propulsion, occupying spaces between predator and prey with fluid ease. Along the seafloor, communities formed in slow patterns, organisms anchoring themselves or gliding just above sediment that had been shaped over long stretches of time. Predators were present, yet their presence did not fracture the balance. They moved through these waters as part of an established order, their forms refined by generations of gradual change rather than sudden necessity. Hunting followed predictable paths, and survival did not demand constant reinvention. In such an environment, specialization could emerge without immediate risk. Structures could develop that leaned toward precision rather than versatility, shaped not by urgency, but by the quiet pressure of efficiency. The warmth of these seas played its own role, extending across regions where sunlight could penetrate deeply enough to sustain layered systems of life. Energy flowed steadily from surface to depth, carried through food webs that remained intact over long periods. There was no abrupt fragmentation, no sudden collapse to interrupt the continuity. Each layer supported the next, forming a structure that allowed unusual adaptations to persist without being immediately tested by instability. Over time, this stability created space for experimentation that did not appear experimental from within the system itself. Organisms evolved forms that fit their specific niches so precisely that they seemed almost fixed, as though the environment had settled around them just as much as they had adapted to it. In these conditions, a design that might appear improbable elsewhere could function without disruption, supported by the consistency of everything surrounding it. Beneath the surface, movement continued in slow cycles. Nutrients circulated, sediments shifted, and populations adjusted in ways that remained gradual and contained. There was no sharp boundary marking change, only a continuous unfolding that allowed life to refine itself over immense spans of time. Within this quiet persistence, the foundations were laid for creatures that would carry forms unlike anything seen before or after. The ocean, in this period, did not resist such forms. It held them, sustained them, and allowed them to exist without contradiction. In its stability, it became a place where even the most unfamiliar structures could find a role, not as anomalies, but as natural outcomes of a system that had settled into balance. The first spiral did not arrive as a revelation, but as an object set quietly among other fragments whose meanings were already understood. It lay within stone that had been opened with care, its surface emerging not as bone or shell, but as a tightly wound curve that resisted immediate recognition. There was no familiar outline to guide interpretation, no symmetry that matched known bodies, only a continuous arc of teeth arranged with an order that seemed deliberate yet entirely out of place. In the 19th century, such discoveries began to appear across distant regions, from the interior of North America to parts of Russia where ancient seabeds had long since hardened into rock. Each specimen carried the same form, a spiral that seemed complete in itself, without any visible connection to a larger structure. The teeth were preserved in dense formation, their alignment consistent, their curvature exact. Nothing surrounded them that might suggest attachment. No fragments of skull, no trace of cartilage, no accompanying bones to hint at proportion or placement. Paleontologists encountered these forms within a scientific landscape that depended on comparison. Fossils were understood by their resemblance to living or previously identified organisms, their functions inferred through patterns that repeated across time. The spiral offered no such familiarity. It did not resemble the jaws of known fish, nor the defensive structures of shelled animals. Its geometry suggested movement, yet its isolation denied any clear mechanism. Without context, it stood apart from the frameworks used to interpret the past. Early descriptions attempted to anchor the structure within existing categories, though each attempt carried uncertainty. Some proposed that the spiral had once been positioned along the body, perhaps extending outward as a defensive appendage. Others imagined it as a form of tail ornamentation, its teeth arranged to deter predators rather than capture prey. A few considered the possibility that it functioned in feeding, though this required a reconsideration of how a mouth might be constructed. None of these interpretations aligned comfortably with the fossil itself. Illustrations from this period reveal a range of possibilities that now seem distant from one another. The spiral was drawn emerging from backs, coiling along flanks, even projecting forward in ways that suggested motion without clear purpose. Each sketch attempted to resolve the same problem, yet no single image held enough certainty to displace the others. The absence of additional material allowed speculation to expand in multiple directions, each shaped as much by imagination as by evidence. As more specimens were uncovered, the pattern did not resolve but deepened. The spirals remained consistent in form, reinforcing the idea that they belonged to a real and repeated organism, yet their isolation persisted. They appeared as singular structures, complete yet incomplete, carrying all the detail of biological growth without the context needed to understand their role. The scientific process, which relied on accumulation and comparison, found itself circling the same uncertainty. The difficulty was not in observing the fossil, but in placing it within a living system. Every known animal presented some trace of its organization, a relationship between parts that could be extended outward to imagine the whole. Here, the relationship was contained entirely within the spiral itself. Growth could be seen in the progression of teeth, each new addition pressing forward in a continuous sequence, yet this insight only emphasized how little else was known. Across decades, the spiral remained an object of quiet disagreement. It was cataloged, discussed, and revisited, its image reproduced in scientific works that offered differing conclusions without final resolution. The fossil did not change, but the interpretations around it shifted with each new attempt to understand it. In this way, it existed not only as a remnant of an ancient organism, but as a reflection of the limits of interpretation, holding its structure intact while resisting the frameworks meant to explain it. Under careful observation, the spiral begins to resolve not as a single object, but as a sequence of repeating elements arranged with unusual discipline. Each tooth sits within a curve that tightens gradually toward its center, forming a structure that appears both compact and continuous. The surface reveals a pattern that does not drift or vary. Instead, it holds a consistent rhythm, each point following the last, with measured spacing and alignment that suggests a controlled process of formation. The curvature itself carries a kind of internal logic. Rather than branching outward or spreading along a line, the teeth follow a path that coils inward, maintaining proportional distance as the arc narrows. This creates a geometry that feels stable, even as it compresses toward its core. The outermost teeth are larger, more exposed, while those closer to the center become smaller and more tightly packed, yet none appear out of place. The entire structure holds together as a single, uninterrupted progression. Looking more closely, the teeth reveal subtle variations that trace the history of their growth. Newer teeth form along one end of the spiral, their edges sharp and less worn, while older teeth are carried forward along the curve. Instead of being shed or replaced in isolation, they remain part of the structure, shifting position as additional teeth emerge behind them. This forward movement creates a continuous record, each tooth marking a moment within an ongoing sequence rather than a cycle of loss and renewal. This pattern differs from the replacement systems observed in modern sharks and most other fish, where teeth are discarded and replaced individually, maintaining a functional row while older elements fall away. In the spiral, nothing is removed. The entire arrangement advances as a unit, preserving every stage of its formation within a single structure. Growth does not erase what came before. It incorporates it, compressing earlier stages into the tightening curve. The result is a form that appears both dynamic and fixed. It grows, yet it does not reorganize. It changes position, yet it does not break apart. Each addition alters the whole without disrupting its coherence. The spiral becomes a living archive of its own development, its geometry shaped by accumulation rather than replacement. Such a system requires a different way of understanding biological structure. Instead of imagining rows that are maintained through constant turnover, this arrangement suggests a process where continuity is preserved through motion. The teeth are not independent units, cycling through a fixed position, but parts of a larger progression that carries them along a defined path. Their function cannot be separated from their placement within the curve, nor from the sequence that binds them together. Across known aquatic life, No direct parallel emerges. While some species display variations in tooth replacement or arrangement, none replicate the combination of continuous growth and retained structure seen here. The spiral stands apart not only in its appearance, but in the process that sustains it. It represents a solution that does not align with familiar patterns, yet remains internally consistent. As the eye follows the curve inward, the structure begins to feel less like an isolated anomaly and more like a system governed by its own set of constraints. Every tooth occupies a position that reflects both its origin and its movement through the sequence. The spiral does not simply hold teeth, it organizes them through time, compressing growth into a form that remains intact even as it evolves. Ideas formed around the spiral, not from certainty, but from the quiet need to place it somewhere within a living body. Without surrounding structures to guide interpretation, the mind began to extend outward from the fossil itself, attaching it to imagined forms that could accommodate its shape. In this process, the spiral became less a discovered feature and more a point of departure, a structure waiting to be anchored to something unseen. One of the earliest interpretations placed it along the tail, where its curvature could be imagined as a rotating or sweeping instrument. In this view, the animal carried the spiral behind it, using motion through water to turn the structure into a form of defense or even offense. The teeth, arranged in their tight progression, seemed capable of cutting through anything that came too close. Movement would supply the force, and the spiral would act as an extension of that motion, a trailing mechanism shaped for contact. Another approach shifted the structure upward, positioning it along the back. Here, the spiral was envisioned as a protective ridge, a fixed blade rising from the body, deterring predators through its presence alone. The uniformity of the teeth suggested durability, a surface that could resist damage while presenting a continuous edge. In this arrangement, the animal did not need to move the structure actively. It simply carried it, allowing its form to serve as a barrier. A different line of thought removed the spiral from active movement altogether, treating it as a stationary tool. In this interpretation, the structure functioned more like a crushing or grinding apparatus, possibly anchored within the body in a way that allowed prey to be pressed against it. The curvature could be seen as a way to hold material in place, the teeth acting not as cutting edges in motion, but as points of resistance within a confined space. Each of these ideas attempted to resolve the same problem, yet each introduced new complications. The tail placement required a degree of control and coordination that did not align easily with known patterns of movement. A structure of such density would have influenced balance and propulsion, creating forces that would need to be countered with precision. The back-mounted version faced similar challenges, as the integration of a rigid spiral into a flexible body raised questions about how the animal moved without disrupting its own structure. The stationary model, while avoiding issues of motion, struggled to explain the progression visible within the spiral itself. The arrangement of teeth, advancing in a continuous sequence, suggested activity over time rather than a fixed surface. Growth patterns indicated movement, not in space, but along the structure, with each new tooth altering the position of those before it. A static interpretation did not fully account for this internal shift. As these models were compared against the fossil in greater detail, inconsistencies became more apparent. The geometry of the spiral did not align cleanly with external placement. Its curvature, when imagined along the body, often resulted in positions that limited effectiveness or interfered with basic function. The teeth, though sharp, were arranged in a way that seemed to favor a directional process, something that unfolded along the curve rather than across it. Gradually, the focus began to shift. Instead of asking how the spiral could be attached externally, attention turned inward, toward the possibility that the structure belonged within the body in a way that had not yet been considered. This shift did not immediately resolve the uncertainty, but it narrowed the range of possibilities. The spiral was no longer treated as an appendage or surface feature, but as part of a system whose nature remained concealed. In this quiet transition, the earlier interpretations did not vanish, but settled into the background, their limitations understood rather than dismissed. What remained was a growing sense that the difficulty lay not in the fossil itself, but in the assumptions brought to it. The spiral had been measured against familiar designs, and in doing so, its differences had been forced into shapes that could not hold them. What remained absent was not a detail, but an entire presence. The spiral carried precision, history, and motion within its curve, yet nothing around it revealed the form that held it in life. There was no outline to follow, no framing structure to anchor it within a body. The fossil preserved what endured, and what endured was only a fragment of something larger that left almost no trace. The reason lay in the nature of the organism itself. Unlike creatures whose skeletons hardened into bone, this animal belonged to a lineage shaped by cartilage, a material flexible and resilient in life, yet far less likely to persist once life had ended. Cartilage does not hold its structure under the long pressures of burial and time. It softens, collapses, and disappears, leaving behind only those parts that resist decay. In this case, the teeth endured, while the framework that supported them faded into absence. Fossilization favors what can withstand transformation. Hard tissues, dense and mineralized, can be preserved as stone replaces their structure over immense spans of time. Soft tissues, even when briefly protected, tend to vanish before such processes can take hold. Water moves through sediment, chemical conditions shift, and what once held form dissolves into the surrounding environment. The result is a record shaped by durability rather than completeness, where certain elements remain while others are lost entirely. This imbalance creates a particular kind of difficulty. The spiral, preserved in detail, offers a clear view of its own construction, yet it exists without the context needed to understand how it functioned within a living organism. Without a skull, there is no indication of orientation, no clear reference for direction or movement. Without supporting structures, there is no measure of scale beyond the spiral itself. The fossil becomes both precise and incomplete at the same time. Attempts to reconstruct the creature from this single element required an unusual form of inference. Instead of building outward from a known framework, paleontologists had to imagine the framework itself, guided only by the properties of the spiral and the environments in which it was found. Each reconstruction became a balance between what the fossil clearly showed and what could only be suggested. The absence of a face was not merely a missing feature, but a missing anchor for the entire interpretation. Over decades, this absence remained constant. New specimens added detail to the spiral, reinforcing its consistency across different locations, yet they did not resolve the larger question. The same pattern persisted, a well-defined structure appearing alone, disconnected from any broader anatomy. The fossil record offered repetition without expansion, clarity without completion. In this way, the creature existed within science as a kind of outline without boundaries. It was known through one of its most distinctive parts, yet that part could not be fully understood in isolation. The spiral hinted at motion, at interaction, at a role within an ecosystem, but these hints could not be confirmed without the structures that once surrounded it. The animal remained present through implication rather than direct evidence. Time did not immediately solve this problem. Even as methods improved and collections grew, the fundamental limitation remained unchanged. The material that would have revealed the creature's full form had already been lost long before discovery. What persisted was a narrow window into its existence, precise in detail, yet confined in scope. Within that limitation, the spiral continued to hold its place, a structure defined with clarity, set against an absence that could not be filled by observation alone. The creature that carried it remained without a face, not because it lacked one, but because the processes that preserved the past had chosen only a single part to endure. At some point, the possibility could no longer be set aside. The spiral might not belong along the body or behind it, but somewhere far more central. The idea settled gradually, shaped by the limits of earlier interpretations, until the structure began to be considered not as an attachment, but as part of the feeding system itself. With that shift, a different kind of problem emerged, one that was no longer about placement alone, but about motion, coordination, and function. A mouth built around a spiral introduces a set of mechanical demands that do not align easily with familiar forms. In most known systems, jaws open and close along a hinge, bringing opposing surfaces together in a controlled, repeatable motion. Teeth are arranged to meet in patterns that grip, cut, or crush, depending on their shape and purpose. The spiral, however, does not present a straight edge or a simple opposing surface. Its curvature suggests movement along a path rather than across a gap. To imagine such a structure functioning as a mouth requires a reconsideration of how motion is applied. The spiral does not simply open and close. It implies a form of progression, a sequence in which different parts of the structure come into use over time. If it were to engage with prey, the interaction would not occur at a single point, but along a curve that continues inward. This introduces the question of how such movement could be coordinated within the confines of a living organism. The act of capturing prey becomes less straightforward under this arrangement. A straight row of teeth can close around an object, holding it in place while force is applied. A spiral, by contrast, offers no immediate enclosure. Its edges do not meet in a way that traps in a single motion. Instead, contact would occur at one section of the curve, with the potential for the prey to move or be displaced before the rest of the structure could engage. This raises concerns about efficiency, as any feeding system must balance energy spent with energy gained. There is also the matter of resistance. As the spiral engages with material, forces would be distributed unevenly along its curve. The outer teeth might encounter resistance first, while inner teeth remain inactive until later in the sequence. Without a clear mechanism to control this progression, the structure could work against itself, applying force in ways that do not contribute to effective feeding. The geometry that gives the spiral its distinct form also complicates its potential use. Energy plays a quiet but constant role in these considerations. Any feeding mechanism must operate within limits, using as little effort as necessary to secure nourishment. A system that requires complex coordination or extended motion risks becoming inefficient, especially in an environment where energy must be conserved. The spiral, at first glance, appears to demand more from the organism than more conventional designs, introducing steps that do not immediately translate into advantage. These challenges made the idea difficult to accept. The structure seemed to resist simple explanations, not because it lacked function, but because its function did not align with expectations shaped by existing examples. The more closely it was examined, the more it appeared to require a different set of assumptions, ones that allowed for movement and interaction beyond the familiar patterns of opening and closing. In this tension between form and function, the spiral remained unresolved. It suggested a method of feeding that was neither clearly inefficient nor easily understood, existing in a space where conventional reasoning reached its limits. The difficulty was not in recognizing that it could be a mouth, but in understanding how such a mouth could operate without contradicting the principles that governed other living systems. Progress did not arrive as a sudden answer, but through small changes in what the fossil was able to reveal. Among the growing collection of specimens, a few appeared with subtle differences, not in the spiral itself, but in the material that surrounded it. These examples carried traces of structure that had not been seen before, faint impressions and partial forms that hinted at a larger arrangement preserved only in fragments. In certain deposits, conditions had slowed the usual process of loss, allowing delicate tissues to leave behind more than absence. The remains were still incomplete, but they carried outlines that suggested proximity between the spiral and other elements. These were not fully formed skulls, nor clear anatomical maps, yet they introduced relationships that had previously been invisible. The spiral no longer stood entirely alone. It began to appear connected, not through direct attachment, but through consistent positioning within these partial remains. Careful study of these specimens revealed patterns that repeated across different locations. The spiral was often found near structures that suggested the front of the body rather than its outer surfaces. Its orientation, once imagined in many directions, began to settle into a narrower range. The curve did not extend outward in a way that matched defensive placement, nor did it align with the trailing motion expected of a tail structure. Instead, it seemed to occupy a position that faced inward, toward where a mouth might be located. This shift was not immediate, nor was it universally accepted at first. Earlier interpretations had shaped expectations, and moving away from them required a reconsideration of how the spiral interacted with the rest of the organism. Yet the emerging evidence carried a quiet consistency. The structure appeared too integrated to be external, too precisely aligned to be incidental. Its placement suggested that it belonged within a functional system rather than along the surface. As more attention was given to these details, the spiral began to be examined in relation to surrounding elements rather than in isolation. The curve of the teeth, when viewed alongside these partial structures, hinted at a direction of movement that pointed inward. The progression of growth, once seen as a simple sequence, took on new meaning when considered within a confined space. The idea that the spiral operated internally began to take hold, not as a speculation, but as a possibility supported by repeated observation. This change in perspective altered the questions being asked. Instead of searching for ways to attach the spiral to the exterior of the body, attention shifted toward understanding how it might fit within the boundaries of a jaw. The structure's geometry, once seen as impractical, began to suggest a different kind of efficiency, one that relied on controlled movement within a limited space. The teeth, arranged along their continuous curve, could be understood as part of a system that guided rather than simply cut. The fossil, in this sense, had not changed. Its form remained the same, its details as precise as before. What changed was the context in which it was viewed. By placing the spiral within a framework suggested by these better preserved specimens, its features began to align with a function that had previously seemed unlikely. The structure that once resisted placement now appeared to belong within a specific region of the body, its role becoming clearer through association rather than direct evidence. In this gradual shift, the spiral moved from the edges of interpretation toward a more central position. It was no longer treated as an isolated curiosity, but as part of an organism whose form could begin to be traced, even if only in outline. The breakthrough did not resolve every uncertainty, but it redirected the search, grounding it in observations that connected the fossil to the body that once carried it. A different kind of observation began when the fossil was no longer approached only from its surface, but from within. Instead of relying on what could be seen directly, researchers turned to methods that allowed the structure to be examined without altering it, passing energy through the stone and recording how it moved through varying densities. The spiral, once limited to its outer form, started to reveal layers that had remained hidden since its burial. Computed tomography introduced a way to move through the fossil slice by slice, tracing internal patterns that could not be accessed by traditional preparation. Each scan captured subtle differences in material, distinguishing between the mineralized teeth and the surrounding matrix, as well as any preserved traces of softer structures that had left faint imprints. These differences, though slight, carried information about how the spiral related to the space around it. The process unfolded gradually, with each layer adding a small piece to a larger reconstruction. Digital models began to form, assembling thin sections into a continuous volume that could be rotated, examined, and explored from multiple angles. What had once been fixed in stone became something that could be navigated, its internal arrangement no longer concealed by its outer surface. The spiral remained central, but it was no longer isolated. Within these reconstructions, the orientation of the structure began to clarify. The curve of the teeth, when viewed in 3 dimensions, aligned in a way that suggested enclosure rather than exposure. The spiral did not extend outward into open space. It sat within boundaries that indicated containment. Its position relative to surrounding material pointed toward an internal placement, consistent with the earlier hints found in better preserved specimens, yet now supported by a more detailed and cohesive view. The advantage of this approach lay in its restraint. Nothing was removed, nothing reshaped. The fossil remained intact, its information accessed without disruption. This allowed for repeated examination, refinement of models, and comparison across multiple specimens without the risk of losing fragile details. The structure could be studied as it existed, preserved within the rock, while still revealing relationships that had previously been inaccessible. As the models became more refined, the spiral's connection to a broader anatomical framework emerged with greater clarity. It appeared nested within a lower region, its curvature following a path that corresponded with what would be expected of a jaw element. The teeth faced inward along the curve, oriented toward a central space rather than outward into the environment. This arrangement suggested interaction with material drawn into the body rather than contact with external surfaces. The 3-dimensional reconstructions allowed movement to be considered in a new way. By visualizing how the spiral occupied space, researchers could begin to imagine how it might have operated within the constraints of surrounding structures. The geometry that once seemed impractical began to align with a system that guided motion along a defined path, contained and directed rather than exposed and uncontrolled. This stage marked a shift from interpretation based largely on analogy to one grounded in direct observation of internal relationships. The fossil, long understood through its external form, now provided insight into its placement within the organism. The spiral was no longer an isolated feature awaiting attachment, but part of a system whose boundaries could be traced with increasing confidence. Through these methods, the invisible became accessible, not through alteration, but through careful measurement and reconstruction. The structure remained as it had always been, yet the ability to see within it changed how it could be understood. The spiral's position, once uncertain, began to settle into a form that connected its geometry to a functional context, allowing it to be viewed not as an anomaly, but as a component within a coherent biological design. What emerged from these layered observations was not a new structure, but a new certainty about where the existing one belonged. The spiral, once imagined along the edges of the body, settled into a position that aligned with the lower portion of the jaw. It was not exposed outward or carried externally, but held within a space that guided its form and limited its movement to a defined path. This placement did not force the structure into familiarity, yet it allowed its features to align with a functional system. Within this arrangement, the curvature of the teeth took on a clearer direction. Rather than facing outward in defense or projection, they arced inward, following the spiral toward a central line that led deeper into the body. Each tooth, positioned along this curve, pointed along the path of the structure's progression, creating a sequence that guided contact rather than simply meeting it. The geometry that once appeared difficult to place began to reveal a coherence that depended on its internal setting. The lower jaw, shaped to accommodate this spiral, provided a boundary that contained its motion. The structure did not rotate freely, nor did it extend beyond its limits. Instead, it occupied a channel where its movement could be controlled and directed. The relationship between the spiral and the surrounding cartilage formed a system in which each part supported the other, allowing the teeth to function as part of a coordinated mechanism rather than as an isolated feature. Growth within this system followed the same continuous pattern seen in the fossil, yet its implications became clearer in this context. New teeth formed at one end of the spiral, while older teeth advanced along the curve, maintaining their position within the structure. Nothing was discarded, and nothing was replaced in the conventional sense. The entire arrangement progressed forward, preserving each stage of development within the working system. This continuity allowed the structure to remain functional without interruption, its capacity maintained through accumulation rather than renewal. Among known fish, such a system remains distinct. While many species rely on cycles of tooth loss and replacement to sustain their feeding ability, this arrangement operates through retention and movement. The spiral carries its history within its present form, each tooth contributing to function regardless of its position along the curve. The structure does not depend on clearing space for new growth, but on integrating that growth into an existing sequence. As the placement within the lower jaw became more certain, the role of the spiral shifted from speculation to confirmation. Its orientation, its growth pattern, and its relationship to surrounding structures all pointed toward a feeding function. The teeth were not arranged for display or defense, but for interaction with material drawn into the mouth. Their inward curve suggested a process that guided prey along a controlled path, aligning with the direction of the spiral itself. This understanding did not emerge as a single conclusion, but as a convergence of details that no longer conflicted when viewed together. The geometry, once seen as impractical, now matched the constraints of its position. The growth pattern, once puzzling, aligned with a system that required continuity rather than replacement. The spiral, long considered in isolation, became part of a coordinated structure that supported its function. In this alignment, the structure resolved into something that could be understood without losing its distinctiveness. It remained unlike the jaws of other fish, yet it operated within the same fundamental need to capture and process food. The difference lay not in its purpose, but in the path it followed to achieve it, a path shaped by a form that carried its own logic within the confines of the body that held it. Movement, when considered within this arrangement, does not begin with opening and closing alone, but with a controlled progression along the curve itself. The spiral sits within the lower jaw as a fixed structure in position, yet capable of guiding motion through the sequence of its teeth. Rather than acting as a single surface that meets another, it functions through the passage of its edges, each segment engaging in turn as the jaw closes and shifts. As the lower jaw rises, the outer portion of the spiral is the first to make contact. The teeth at this edge meet whatever lies between the jaws, initiating an interaction that does not remain localized. Instead of holding at that point, the structure allows the contact to travel inward along the curve. The alignment of the teeth, set in their continuous arc, supports this movement, creating a pathway along which the interaction progresses. This produces a rolling motion that unfolds within the confined space of the mouth. The spiral does not rotate freely in the way a wheel might, yet its geometry creates the effect of rotation as different teeth come into position. Each closing motion advances the point of contact deeper along the curve, bringing successive edges into use. The result is a sequence rather than a single action, a process that moves through the structure instead of stopping at its surface. In this sequence, the teeth function collectively, not as isolated cutting points, but as a continuous line of edges that pass through the same space over time. As one tooth completes its role, the next follows, maintaining the interaction without interruption. This creates an effect similar to a conveyor, where each segment contributes to a sustained process. The prey is not simply gripped or struck, but guided along a path defined by the curvature of the spiral. The upper jaw, though less visually distinctive in the fossil record, plays an essential role in this coordination. It provides the opposing surface against which the spiral operates, creating the necessary resistance for the teeth to engage effectively. The interaction between the two jaws is not symmetrical, as the lower structure carries the complex geometry, while the upper surface offers a more stable counterpart. Together, they form a system in which motion is directed and contained. This coordination allows the feeding process to remain controlled despite the unusual design. The spiral's progression ensures that contact is maintained, while the upper jaw stabilizes the material being drawn inward. The movement does not rely on speed or force alone, but on the continuity of the sequence. Each part of the structure contributes in turn, reducing the need for abrupt or excessive motion. The uniqueness of this mechanism lies in how it integrates growth and function. The same progression that adds new teeth also defines how the structure operates during feeding. The curve is not only a record of development, but a guide for movement, shaping how the organism interacts with its environment. This alignment between form and function allows the spiral to operate effectively within its constraints. In this system, feeding becomes a process that unfolds along a path rather than at a point. The spiral does not close around its target in a single motion, but engages it through a sequence that draws it inward. Each step follows naturally from the last, creating a continuous interaction that reflects the structure's design. The jaw moves, the spiral advances through its own geometry, and the mechanism completes itself without requiring any element beyond what is already present within its form. Feeding within this system unfolds as a gradual inward process rather than a single decisive action. The initial contact does not end the interaction, but begins a controlled movement that carries the prey along a defined path. As the jaws close and shift, the spiral guides what has been captured deeper into its curve, each segment of teeth contributing to a sequence that continues beyond the first moment of contact. This inward progression changes the nature of how prey is handled. Instead of relying on pressure to immobilize or break apart what is captured, the structure applies repeated contact along its arc. Each section of the spiral introduces a new edge, maintaining engagement while advancing the material further along the curve. The motion does not depend on a single point of force, but on continuity, where the interaction is sustained over time rather than concentrated in one place. The effect of this process is closer to slicing than crushing. The teeth, aligned in their sequence, pass over the same material in succession, each contributing to a gradual division rather than a sudden break. This approach reduces the need for heavy structural support that would be required for crushing, allowing the system to operate with a lighter framework. The cutting edges do not meet resistance all at once, but encounter it in stages, distributing effort across the movement. Such a method aligns closely with prey that does not require forceful compression. Organisms with softer bodies, lacking rigid external protection, would respond differently to this kind of interaction. Instead of resisting through hardness, they yield under repeated contact, allowing the spiral to draw them inward without the need for high pressure. The structure appears suited to this kind of material, where precision and continuity offer an advantage over strength alone. Within the environment where this organism existed, such prey were present in forms that moved through the water with flexibility rather than rigidity. Their bodies could be engaged without the need for crushing surfaces, making them compatible with a system that relied on controlled progression. The spiral, in this context, does not need to overcome resistance through force, but through sustained contact that guides and divides. Efficiency emerges from this alignment between structure and prey. By operating along a path that matches the properties of what it encounters, the feeding mechanism avoids unnecessary expenditure. Energy is applied in a sequence that maintains contact without requiring repeated attempts to secure or reposition. Once engaged, the prey is drawn inward through the natural motion of the jaw and the geometry of the spiral, reducing the need for additional effort. This approach also limits the likelihood of loss during feeding. A system that grips or crushes at a single point may allow material to escape if the initial contact is incomplete. Here, the progression along the curve ensures that even if the first engagement is partial, subsequent sections of the spiral continue the interaction. The structure compensates for variation through repetition, maintaining effectiveness across different moments of contact. In this way, the feeding strategy does not resemble those seen in modern predators that rely on speed or force to secure their prey. Instead, it reflects a design that emphasizes continuity, guiding material along a controlled path where each part of the structure contributes in turn. The spiral, shaped by its growth and placement, becomes both the record of its development and the means by which it sustains the organism, aligning form and function within a system that operates through steady, coordinated movement. Fragments of other lives appear alongside the spiral in the same layers of stone, not as direct companions, but as quiet traces of a shared environment. Within these deposits, coiled shells and soft-bodied impressions recur with a frequency that suggests more than coincidence. They form a backdrop against which the spiral can be understood, not through direct interaction, but through proximity that reflects the conditions in which both existed. Among these remains are ammonoids, their shells preserved in delicate curves that once housed animals moving through the water with controlled buoyancy. Their forms vary, some tightly coiled, others more open, yet all share a structure built around chambers that regulated their position in the water column. These organisms occupied spaces where movement was steady rather than rapid, their shells offering protection while also limiting sudden escape. Alongside them appear traces of softer creatures, early cephalopods whose bodies lacked rigid external coverings. Their presence is recorded more subtly, often through faint outlines or impressions that suggest flexible forms moving through the same waters. These animals relied on motion and concealment rather than armor, their bodies adapting to a fluid environment where shape could shift and respond. The repeated association of these forms with the spiral suggests a connection shaped by shared habitat and interaction. While direct evidence of feeding remains limited, the alignment between the spiral's structure and the properties of these organisms becomes increasingly apparent. The inward guiding motion of the teeth, combined with their sequential engagement, appears suited to material that yields rather than resists. Ammonoids, though protected by shells, present openings through which their soft bodies extend. The interaction between the spiral and such prey would not rely on breaking the shell itself, but on engaging the exposed tissue. The progression of the teeth along the curve could draw this material inward, applying repeated contact without requiring the force needed to crush the external structure. In this way, the feeding process aligns with the vulnerabilities of the organism rather than its defenses. For softer cephalopods, the compatibility becomes even clearer. Their bodies, lacking rigid protection, would respond to sustained contact along the spiral's path. The slicing motion, distributed across multiple teeth, allows the structure to process such prey without abrupt force. The inward movement ensures that once contact is established, the interaction continues, reducing the likelihood of escape. This alignment between structure and prey suggests a form of specialization that reflects the conditions of the surrounding environment. The spiral does not appear designed for general use across a wide range of prey types. Instead, it fits within a narrower set of interactions where its unique properties offer an advantage. The presence of these organisms within the same deposits supports this interpretation, providing a context in which such a feeding strategy could be sustained. The environment itself reinforces this connection. In waters where these prey were abundant, a mechanism that efficiently engages soft or partially exposed tissue would offer consistent returns. The spiral's design, with its continuous sequence of teeth and inward guiding motion, operates within this niche, matching its function to the available resources. Over time, this relationship between predator and prey would shape both, influencing behavior and adaptation within the ecosystem. The spiral, preserved in its precise form, carries within it the imprint of these interactions, even if the direct evidence remains indirect. The surrounding fossils, though separate, contribute to a picture that brings the feeding strategy into alignment with the living world it once occupied, connecting structure to environment through patterns that emerge across the stone. From the spiral alone, the rest of the body does not reveal itself directly, yet its proportions can be approached through balance. A structure of that scale, carrying dense rows of teeth arranged in a continuous curve, would require a body capable of supporting both its weight and its function. The size of the spiral, when measured across multiple specimens, suggests an animal extending well beyond it, reaching lengths estimated between 6 and 8 meters. This places it among the larger inhabitants of its environment, not as a drifting presence, but as an active participant within the moving layers of the sea. Such length implies a form shaped for steady motion. A body of this size, operating within open water, would need to reduce resistance as it moved, allowing it to travel without excessive expenditure. The outline that emerges from this requirement is one of gradual tapering. broader at the center, where mass is concentrated, narrowing toward both ends to guide water smoothly along its surface. This arrangement supports sustained movement rather than sudden bursts, aligning with a feeding system that relies on controlled interaction rather than rapid pursuit. The structure of cartilage, though absent from direct preservation, further informs this reconstruction. Flexible and resilient, it allows for a body that can maintain shape while adapting to the forces of movement. Unlike rigid bone, cartilage distributes stress more evenly, supporting continuous motion through water without the weight that heavier materials would impose. This would have enabled the animal to move with a certain fluidity, maintaining stability as it navigated its environment. Fins, though not preserved in association with the spiral, can be inferred through comparison with related forms. Lateral extensions along the body would provide balance, preventing unwanted rotation and allowing for adjustments in direction. A tail, positioned at the rear, would supply propulsion, its motion translating into forward movement that carries the entire structure through the water. These elements, while not directly visible, align with the requirements of an organism of this size and shape. In its overall form, the animal likely resembled modern shark-like silhouettes, though the similarity remains general rather than exact. The streamlined profile, the distribution of mass, and the arrangement of fins all point toward a design that has appeared in different lineages, shaped by the shared demands of aquatic movement. Yet within this familiar outline, differences would have remained, particularly in the structure of the head and jaw, where the spiral introduced a form not seen in living species. The head, shaped to accommodate the internal spiral, would have differed from the tapered snouts of many modern fish. Its contours would need to support the placement of the jaw and the movement within it, creating a form that balanced external flow with internal function. This balance suggests a head that was neither overly elongated nor sharply pointed, but adapted to house the mechanism without disrupting the body's overall efficiency in motion. As these elements come together, the animal begins to take shape not through direct observation, but through the alignment of constraints. Size, movement, and internal structure each contribute to a form that fits within the environment it occupied. The spiral, though central, does not define the entire body on its own. Instead, it integrates into a larger system, one that supports both the demands of movement and the requirements of feeding. The result is a form that moves through water with purpose, neither drifting nor rushing, but maintaining a steady presence within its surroundings. Its shape reflects a balance between the unusual structure it carries and the broader patterns that govern life in motion, allowing it to exist as part of a system where even the most distinctive features must align with the demands of the whole. Classification, when applied to this animal, does not follow the familiar outline suggested by its overall shape. The streamlined body and active movement through water bring to mind forms that are widely recognized today, yet beneath that resemblance lies a different lineage. The structure of the jaw, already distinct in its spiral arrangement, reflects a deeper separation that extends through the rest of its anatomy. Rather than belonging to the group that includes modern sharks, this organism is more closely aligned with chimeras, a lineage that diverged long before many of the features associated with present-day species became established. This relationship places it within a broader category of cartilaginous fish, yet on a branch that developed along its own path. The similarities in material, such as the presence of cartilage rather than bone, connect these groups, but their internal structures reveal differences that define separate evolutionary directions. The skull, though rarely preserved, can be approached through comparison with related forms that share this lineage. In chimeras, the arrangement of the jaw differs from that of sharks, with the upper jaw more firmly integrated into the skull rather than moving independently. This creates a system where motion is distributed differently, relying less on wide opening and more on coordinated shifts within a contained space. Such a configuration aligns more closely with the placement of the spiral, which operates within the lower jaw and depends on controlled interaction rather than large, sweeping movement. Other anatomical features support this distinction. The positioning of gill openings, the structure of fins, and the overall organization of the body follow patterns that differ subtly but consistently from those seen in sharks. These differences are not always visible in the fossil record of this specific animal, yet they can be inferred through its classification within a group that shares these traits. The spiral itself, as part of the jaw system, reinforces this placement by aligning with mechanisms that are not present in modern shark anatomy. The evolutionary path that led to this organism reflects a divergence that occurred early when cartilaginous fish were still exploring a range of forms and functions. Within this broader context, different lineages developed distinct solutions to similar challenges, resulting in bodies that may appear similar at a glance, but differ in their internal organization. The resemblance to sharks, in this case, arises from shared environmental pressures rather than direct ancestry, shaping outward form while allowing internal systems to evolve independently. This distinction becomes clearer when considering the feeding mechanism as part of the whole organism. The spiral, integrated into the lower jaw, operates within a framework that does not match the hinge-based systems of sharks. Its movement, coordination, and growth pattern reflect a lineage that approached feeding through a different set of structural constraints. The jaw does not simply open and close in wide arcs, but guides motion along a defined path, consistent with the anatomical arrangement seen in related groups. Over time, these differences define a branch of life that remains separate from the lineage that would lead to modern sharks. The animal occupies a place within this branching structure, connected to chimeras through shared traits while maintaining its own unique characteristics. Its form represents a combination of features that align with its lineage, even as they produce a silhouette that recalls other groups. In this way, the animal stands as an example of how outward similarity can mask deeper distinctions. The body moves through water in a manner that appears familiar, yet the structures that support that movement follow a different pattern. The spiral, central to its identity, reflects this divergence, embodying a design that fits within its lineage rather than conforming to the expectations shaped by more widely known forms. Within the layered structure of the Permian seas, roles were not defined only by size or speed, but by how precisely an organism fit into the resources around it. This animal, shaped by its internal spiral and the movement that guided it, occupied a position that did not overlap easily with others. Its way of feeding, already distinct in form, placed it within a narrow range of interactions that few other predators could access in the same way. Most hunters in these waters relied on more direct approaches, capturing prey through force, speed, or the ability to enclose and hold. Their jaws followed patterns that allowed them to act quickly, securing food in a single motion before resistance could build. In contrast, the spiral-based system operated through progression, engaging prey along a path that unfolded over time. This difference in method meant that it did not compete directly with those relying on immediate capture. The prey it engaged, shaped by their own forms and behaviors, were not equally accessible to all predators. Soft-bodied organisms and those partially protected by shells occupied spaces where rapid force was not always the most effective approach. The spiral, with its inward guiding motion and continuous sequence of contact, aligned with these characteristics. It interacted with prey in a way that reduced the need for sudden force, allowing it to operate efficiently within a specific range of targets. This alignment created a form of separation within the ecosystem. While other predators focused on prey that required speed or strength to overcome, this animal moved within a narrower field, engaging organisms that matched its method. The overlap between these roles remained limited, reducing direct competition and allowing multiple strategies to exist side by side without constant conflict. Each approach drew from different aspects of the same environment, distributing pressure across the system. Specialization, in this context, offered a clear advantage. By refining its structure and behavior to match a particular type of prey, the animal could operate with consistency, relying on a method that remained effective within its niche. The spiral, integrated into its feeding system, did not need to adapt to a wide range of conditions. Instead, it functioned within a set of interactions that remained stable over long periods, supported by the abundance of suitable prey in its surroundings. This stability allowed the animal to maintain its role without frequent adjustment. Its design, while unusual, did not require constant change to remain effective. The environment provided the conditions needed for its feeding strategy to persist, and the structure of the spiral supported that persistence through its continuous growth and coordinated movement. Together, these elements formed a system that operated with a degree of efficiency shaped by its focus. At the same time, this specialization defined the limits of its interactions. The feeding mechanism, so precisely aligned with certain types of prey, did not extend easily beyond them. The same features that provided efficiency within its niche also constrained its ability to adapt to different forms of food. This balance between advantage and limitation existed quietly within the system, not as a conflict, but as a condition shaped by its design. Within the broader ecosystem, the presence of such a predator contributed to a layered structure of interactions, where different methods coexisted without direct overlap. Its role was neither dominant across all prey nor marginal within its own range, but defined by the specificity of its function. The spiral, central to this role, reflects a form that does not compete by matching others, but by operating where others do not, occupying a space shaped by its own distinct approach to feeding. What appears unusual when viewed in isolation begins to settle when considered within the quiet pressures that shape living systems. Form does not emerge to satisfy expectation, nor does it follow patterns that feel familiar to later observers. It develops through small adjustments, each one preserved when it supports survival, each one carried forward when it aligns with the demands of the environment. In this way, the spiral does not need to resemble other structures to function effectively. It only needs to work within the conditions that shaped it. The curve of the spiral reflects this process, not as an aesthetic choice, but as a result of repeated refinement. Its geometry allows cutting edges to be arranged in a sequence that remains active throughout the feeding motion. Instead of relying on a single contact point, the structure distributes interaction along its length, bringing multiple edges into use over time. This arrangement increases the likelihood that contact will be maintained, allowing the system to operate with continuity rather than interruption. Efficiency arises not from force alone, but from how that force is applied. The spiral's progression ensures that each tooth contributes to the process, reducing the need for repeated attempts or excessive pressure. As one edge completes its role, the next follows without delay, creating a sustained interaction that moves inward along the curve. This sequence allows the structure to engage effectively without requiring the abrupt movements that characterize other feeding systems. The continuous growth pattern further supports this function. Instead of losing teeth and replacing them in cycles, the spiral retains each stage of its development, integrating new growth into the existing structure. This prevents gaps from forming, ensuring that the sequence remains intact. The system does not pause for renewal, nor does it rely on the removal of older elements to maintain effectiveness. Each tooth remains part of the mechanism, contributing to its operation regardless of its position along the curve. Such continuity reduces the risk of failure. In systems where teeth are shed, there are moments when replacement is incomplete, when the structure operates with temporary gaps. Here, the progression of growth avoids that interruption, maintaining a consistent arrangement that supports ongoing function. The spiral carries its own maintenance within its design, allowing it to remain effective without the need for external adjustment. This alignment between growth and function reflects a broader adaptation to the environment in which the organism lived. The available prey, the conditions of the water, and the stability of the ecosystem all contributed to shaping a system that did not need to change rapidly. The spiral fits within this context, operating in a way that matches the properties of what it encounters, allowing it to function with a degree of efficiency that does not depend on versatility. What may appear improbable when viewed from a distance becomes coherent when understood as part of a continuous process. The structure does not exist in opposition to the principles that govern life, but within them, shaped by the same forces that guide more familiar forms. Its difference lies not in defiance of those principles, but in the path it followed as it adapted to its surroundings. In this light, the spiral becomes less an anomaly and more a reflection of how varied solutions can arise from the same underlying conditions. It demonstrates that effectiveness is not bound to a single form, but can emerge through arrangements that diverge from expectation while remaining fully aligned with function. Precision, while effective within stable conditions, carries with it a quiet dependence on those same conditions remaining unchanged. The spiral, shaped to interact with a narrow range of prey, reflects a system that functions best when its surroundings continue to provide what it expects. Its structure, refined for a specific method, does not extend easily beyond that range, and this limitation becomes part of its design as much as its efficiency. Within the environment that sustained it, this dependence would not have appeared as a weakness. The availability of suitable prey, combined with the consistency of the surrounding ecosystem, allowed the feeding strategy to operate without interruption. The spiral's inward guiding motion, its continuous sequence of cutting edges, and its alignment with softer forms of prey all contributed to a system that worked with little need for adjustment. As long as these conditions persisted, the specialization remained an advantage. However, specialization narrows the path available to an organism when conditions begin to shift. A feeding system designed for a particular type of prey does not easily adapt to alternatives that differ in structure or behavior. The spiral, with its reliance on sustained contact along a defined curve, does not lend itself to handling harder, more resistant forms. Its geometry, while efficient within its niche, does not provide the versatility required to engage a broader range of targets. This limitation becomes more apparent when considered alongside other predators that share the same environment. Generalist feeders, equipped with structures that allow them to capture and process a variety of prey, maintain flexibility in the face of change. Their methods, though less specialized, offer resilience, allowing them to shift between available resources as conditions vary. The spiral, by contrast, remains tied to a narrower set of interactions, its effectiveness closely linked to the continued presence of specific prey types. The balance between efficiency and adaptability is not immediately visible in stable environments. It exists as a latent condition, one that only becomes significant when the system begins to change. As long as the surrounding ecosystem supports the specialized design, the limitations remain untested. The spiral continues to function as intended, its structure aligned with the resources available, its method sustained through repetition. Yet within any system, change is not absent, only gradual. Subtle variations in population, shifts in distribution, or changes in environmental conditions can alter the availability of prey over time. For a specialized predator, even small adjustments in these factors can have a disproportionate effect. A reduction in suitable prey does not simply reduce opportunity. It challenges the entire feeding system, which lacks the flexibility to compensate. In this context, the spiral's precision becomes both its strength and its constraint. The same features that allow it to operate efficiently within its niche also define the boundaries of its effectiveness. It does not possess the structural diversity to engage with a wide range of prey, nor the behavioral flexibility to shift easily between different strategies. Its design is focused, and that focus limits its range. This condition does not imply failure, but rather reflects a balance that is inherent in specialized forms. The organism exists within a system that supports its design, and as long as that system remains stable, the advantages of specialization outweigh its risks. The vulnerability emerges only when the balance shifts, when the conditions that once aligned with the structure begin to change. In this way, the spiral carries within it not only the record of its function, but the outline of its limits, shaped by the same processes that made it effective. Time, when traced through stone, does not always reveal sudden change. In some intervals, it stretches with a steady continuity, where forms persist with little alteration, their presence marked not by variation, but by repetition across distant layers. The spiral appears within this kind of interval, re-emerging again and again in deposits separated by both space and time, its structure remaining consistent as the surrounding sediments record the slow passage of millions of years. Across the Permian period, these occurrences form a pattern that extends beyond isolated discovery. Specimens have been found in regions that were once connected by ancient seas, now separated by continents that have long since shifted apart. This distribution suggests that the organism was not confined to a narrow range, but moved through a broad expanse of its environment, occupying waters that shared similar conditions. The spiral, preserved in these different locations, carries the same defining features, indicating a stability in its form that persisted despite geographic separation. Such consistency points toward a role within the ecosystem that did not require constant adjustment. The feeding mechanism, already aligned with specific types of prey, appears to have remained effective over extended periods. The surrounding environment, with its stable conditions and recurring availability of suitable organisms, provided a foundation that allowed this design to endure. The spiral did not need to change rapidly because the conditions it depended on did not shift in ways that demanded immediate adaptation. Within this stability, the organism maintained a presence that can be understood as a form of quiet dominance. It did not dominate through overwhelming force or by displacing all others, but through persistence within its niche. Its specialization allowed it to operate efficiently where others did not, and the consistency of its environment ensured that this role remained available. Over time, this resulted in a long continuity, where the same structure appears without significant deviation, reflecting a balance between form and function that remained intact. The fossil record supports this interpretation through the repetition of the spiral across layers that span large portions of the Permian timeline. Each occurrence reinforces the idea that the organism was not a brief experiment, but a sustained presence. Its design, once established, proved capable of supporting survival across changing local conditions as long as the broader structure of the ecosystem remained stable. The spiral's persistence becomes a marker of this continuity, its form unchanged as it passes through different intervals of time. This endurance also reflects the integration of the organism within its environment. It was not operating at the margins, but within a system that supported its feeding strategy and movement. The distribution of its fossils suggests that it occupied regions where these conditions were met, moving through waters that maintained the balance required for its specialization. Its presence across these regions indicates that the niche it occupied was not limited to a single location, but extended across a wider network of habitats. In this extended continuity, the spiral becomes more than a singular structure. It becomes a signal of stability within the ancient seas. Its repeated appearance across time and space reflects a system that allowed it to remain effective without significant change. The organism, shaped by its environment, in turn reflects that environment through its persistence. Over millions of years, this quiet alignment between form, function, and environment allowed the spiral to endure, its presence woven into the fabric of the Permian seas as a consistent and unbroken thread. Change does not always arrive as disruption. It often begins as a shift so gradual that it blends into the background of what once felt constant. In the waters where this organism had long moved with consistency, the balance that sustained its role began to adjust in ways that were not immediately visible, yet present in the underlying conditions that shaped life across the system. The chemistry of the ocean, held steady over long intervals, started to drift. Dissolved gases shifted in concentration, altering the exchange between water and the atmosphere above. These changes did not transform the environment all at once, but introduced subtle differences in how energy moved through the system. Organisms that depended on stable chemical conditions began to experience variations that, while slight, accumulated over time. Oxygen, a quiet but essential component of marine life, followed this gradual change. Its distribution within the water column became less uniform, creating regions where availability fluctuated. In some areas, levels declined enough to influence how organisms functioned, affecting movement, growth, and interaction. These shifts did not remove life from these regions, but they altered the conditions under which it persisted, introducing a layer of constraint that had not been present before. The organisms that formed the foundation of the food web responded to these changes in ways that extended outward through the ecosystem. Populations adjusted, some becoming less abundant, others shifting in distribution to remain within favorable conditions. These adjustments were not abrupt, but they altered the patterns of availability that predators relied upon. The consistency that had once supported specialized feeding strategies began to soften, replaced by a more variable landscape of resources. Within this evolving environment, interactions between species became less predictable. The alignment between predator and prey, once stable, started to shift as the underlying conditions changed. Prey that had been consistently available began to appear in different regions or in reduced numbers, altering the pathways through which energy moved. Predators, in turn, encountered a system that no longer provided the same steady opportunities. These changes extended beyond individual species, affecting the structure of the ecosystem as a whole. Relationships that had been maintained through long periods of stability began to adjust, not through sudden collapse, but through gradual reconfiguration. Each shift in chemistry or oxygen levels introduced a small change in how organisms interacted, and over time, these changes accumulated into a broader transformation. For an organism shaped by a specific alignment with its environment, these shifts introduced a new condition. The feeding system, refined to operate within a stable context, now encountered variability that it had not been designed to accommodate. The spiral, unchanged in its structure, continued to function as it always had, yet the conditions surrounding it no longer matched with the same precision. The early signs of ecological stress did not announce themselves through visible disruption, but through these subtle imbalances. Slight reductions in prey, minor shifts in distribution, and gradual changes in the environment began to influence the system as a whole. The effects were distributed, touching many parts of the ecosystem at once, yet often remaining below the threshold of immediate recognition. In this quiet transition, the stability that had supported millions of years of continuity began to give way to a more dynamic state. The ocean, still vast and active, carried within it the beginnings of change, expressed not through sudden events, but through a gradual alteration of the conditions that had once remained constant. Pressure rarely gathers in a single place. It moves through a system, shifting from one layer to the next, carried along the same pathways that once sustained balance. As the underlying conditions of the ocean continued to change, the effects began to concentrate within the relationships that connected predator and prey, altering patterns that had remained stable for long stretches of time. Populations of the organisms that formed the base of this feeding structure no longer maintained their previous consistency. Some declined gradually, their numbers reduced not through sudden loss, but through a series of small adjustments that accumulated across generations. Others shifted in distribution, moving toward regions where conditions remained more favorable. The result was not an absence, but a thinning, a reduction in the density and predictability that had once supported specialized forms of feeding. For predators that relied on these organisms, the change was immediate in its consequences, even if gradual in its onset. Encounters that had once been frequent became less certain, requiring more movement, more time, and more energy to achieve the same outcome. The feeding process, still governed by the same internal mechanisms, now operated within an environment that no longer aligned as precisely with its design. As availability declined, overlap between predators began to increase. Species that had previously occupied distinct niches found themselves drawing from the same reduced resources. The separation that had once limited direct competition became less defined, replaced by a shared dependence on what remained. Interactions between predators, once indirect, now carried a greater degree of pressure as each sought to secure enough to sustain itself. This shift did not create immediate conflict, but it altered the balance that had allowed multiple strategies to coexist without interference. The efficiency of a specialized system depends on the consistent presence of suitable prey, and as that presence diminished, the advantages of specialization began to narrow. The spiral, unchanged in its form, continued to function as designed, yet the opportunities for it to operate effectively became less frequent. Generalist predators, with their broader range of feeding options, encountered this change differently. Their ability to shift between prey types allowed them to adjust to the new conditions with greater flexibility. While they too experienced the effects of reduced availability, their feeding systems provided alternatives that could compensate for the loss of specific resources. This difference in adaptability introduced a subtle imbalance within the predator community. For the specialized hunter, each missed opportunity carried a greater weight. The feeding mechanism, refined for a particular interaction, did not extend easily to other forms of prey that differed in structure or behavior. The same features that had once provided efficiency now limited the ability to respond to change. The spiral continued, its inward guiding motion, its sequence intact, yet the conditions required for its effectiveness were no longer as reliably present. Over time, this pressure accumulated. It did not manifest as a single event, but as a gradual tightening of constraints within the system. The pathways through which energy moved became less stable, and the connections between species grew more strained. Each layer of the food chain reflected these changes, passing their effects upward through the structure. In this evolving environment, the balance that had supported long periods of stability began to shift toward a state of uncertainty. The interactions that once unfolded with consistency now carried variability, and the systems that depended on that consistency faced increasing pressure as the conditions continued to change. Variability, once subtle and dispersed, begins to gather into patterns that no longer settle back into their previous state. The ocean, which had long maintained a quiet continuity, starts to carry fluctuations that extend beyond isolated changes, linking together into broader shifts that move through the entire system. These shifts do not arrive as singular events, but as a sequence of variations that accumulate, each one altering the conditions in ways that ripple outward. Temperature, chemistry, and circulation begin to move with less consistency. Waters that once held stable properties across wide regions start to display differences that change over shorter intervals. These variations affect how nutrients are distributed, how organisms grow, and how interactions unfold. The steady gradients that once guided movement and behavior become less reliable, replaced by conditions that shift from one period to the next. Within this changing environment, marine ecosystems begin to lose the predictability that had supported their structure. The timing of life cycles, the distribution of species, and the pathways of energy transfer all begin to adjust in response to the evolving conditions. What had once followed a consistent pattern now shows variation, creating a system where outcomes are less certain. The relationships between species, built on long periods of stability, begin to reflect this new variability. For organisms that depend on specific conditions, this change introduces a layer of stress that extends beyond immediate survival. It affects growth, reproduction, and the ability to maintain position within the ecosystem. Prey species, already influenced by earlier shifts, experience further pressure as their environments become less consistent. Their populations fluctuate more widely, and their distribution becomes less predictable, altering the availability of resources for those that depend on them. Predators, in turn, encounter a system that no longer offers the same degree of alignment between their feeding strategies and the resources available. The pathways that once guided interactions become less defined, and the effort required to maintain those interactions increases. The balance between energy gained and energy spent begins to shift, reflecting the broader instability within the environment. This instability does not remain confined to individual interactions. It spreads through the food web, connecting species through a chain of dependencies that amplify the effects of each change. A fluctuation at one level influences those above and below, creating a network of responses that extend across the entire ecosystem. The system, once buffered by its stability, becomes more sensitive to variation, with each shift contributing to a larger pattern of change. As these patterns develop, the ocean moves away from the conditions that had supported long periods of continuity. The fluctuations do not cancel each other out, nor do they return to a stable baseline. Instead, they build upon one another, creating a state where change becomes a defining feature rather than an exception. The environment, still vast and dynamic, now carries within it a growing unpredictability that shapes how life persists within it. Within this evolving system, the structures and behaviors that once aligned with stable conditions face a different set of demands. The spiral, integrated into a feeding strategy shaped by consistency, continues to operate as it always has, yet the environment around it no longer provides the same steady framework. The interactions it depends on become less certain, reflecting the broader shifts that move through the ecosystem. In this way, the ocean transitions from a state of balance to one of ongoing adjustment, where variability becomes part of the system itself, influencing every level of life within it. Far from the ocean's surface, beyond the reach of currents and tides, processes began that would slowly extend their influence across the entire planet. Beneath the land, vast regions of volcanic activity intensified, not in isolated eruptions, but in sustained outpourings that released immense volumes of material over extended periods. These events did not unfold in a single moment. They progressed through repeated episodes, each one adding to a growing accumulation of change. As volcanic systems expanded, they introduced large quantities of gases into the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide, among the most significant of these, began to rise in concentration, altering the balance that had long governed the exchange between air and ocean. Alongside it came other gases, some influencing temperature, others interacting with chemical processes that extended beyond the atmosphere itself. These additions did not remain confined to the regions where they originated, but spread globally, carried by atmospheric circulation. The increase in atmospheric gases initiated a gradual shift in climate. Temperatures began to rise, not abruptly, but through a steady accumulation that influenced both land and sea. Warmer conditions affected how water moved, how it retained dissolved gases, and how organisms functioned within it. The ocean, connected to the atmosphere through constant exchange, reflected these changes in its own chemistry and behavior. At the same time, the interaction between these gases and the ocean introduced further alterations. As carbon dioxide dissolved into the water, it contributed to changes in acidity, affecting the conditions under which many organisms maintained their structures. The balance of chemical processes within the ocean shifted, influencing how nutrients were cycled and how life sustained itself across different levels of the ecosystem. These changes did not occur in isolation. They interacted with the existing fluctuations that had already begun to influence the system, amplifying their effects and extending their reach. The gradual instability that had emerged within marine environments now connected to broader planetary processes, creating a network of change that moved through multiple layers of the Earth's systems at once. Evidence of these developments appears in the geological record as a sequence of signals rather than a single marker. Layers of rock preserve traces of volcanic material, shifts in chemical composition, and changes in the distribution of elements that reflect the evolving atmosphere. These signals, when examined together, reveal a pattern of increasing activity, a progression that leads toward a threshold rather than a sudden event. Within the ocean, the effects of these changes continued to build. Rising temperatures influenced circulation patterns, altering how water moved between regions and depths. Chemical shifts affected the availability of essential elements, while variations in oxygen levels began to intensify in certain areas. These factors combined to create conditions that were increasingly different from those that had supported long periods of stability. The organisms within this system experienced these changes not as isolated events, but as a continuous alteration of their environment. Each shift influenced the next, creating a cascade of effects that extended through the food web. The connections between species, already under strain, encountered new pressures as the underlying conditions continued to evolve. In this progression, the approach of a larger transformation becomes visible not through a single moment, but through the accumulation of changes that move steadily toward a point of convergence. The volcanic activity, the rising atmospheric gases, and the shifting climate all contribute to a system that is no longer maintaining its previous balance. The ocean, still vast and active, now carries within it the signals of a transition that extends beyond gradual variation into a broader and more consequential change. There comes a point where gradual change gathers enough momentum that it no longer blends into the background. The processes that had been building across long stretches of time begin to align, their combined effects moving beyond adjustment into transformation. What had once unfolded in quiet increments now converges into a period where the balance of the system shifts in ways that extend across the entire planet. Volcanic activity, already present in earlier stages, expands into a scale that reshapes both land and atmosphere. Vast regions release continuous flows of material, covering large areas and sending immense volumes of gases upward. These emissions do not disperse quickly. They accumulate, altering the composition of the atmosphere in ways that intensify the changes already underway. Carbon dioxide levels rise sharply, reinforcing the warming that had been gradually increasing. As temperatures climb, the ocean responds in multiple ways at once. Warmer water holds less dissolved oxygen, and circulation patterns that once distributed gases and nutrients begin to weaken. The movement between surface and depth becomes less effective, limiting the renewal of oxygen in deeper regions. Areas that once supported active ecosystems begin to experience reductions in available oxygen, creating conditions where many organisms can no longer function as they once did. At the same time, the increased presence of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere leads to greater absorption into the ocean. This process alters the chemical balance of the water, shifting it toward greater acidity. The change affects organisms that rely on stable chemical conditions to maintain their structures, particularly those with shells or other mineral components. As acidity increases, the ability to form and sustain these structures becomes more difficult, influencing survival across multiple levels of the ecosystem. These processes do not occur independently. Warming, acidification, and oxygen depletion interact, each amplifying the effects of the others. Warmer temperatures accelerate chemical reactions, while reduced oxygen levels limit the resilience of organisms already under stress. The combined impact creates conditions that extend beyond the range in which many species can adapt, pushing the system toward a threshold where continuity is no longer maintained. Within marine environments, the effects spread rapidly through the interconnected layers of life. Organisms at the base of the food web experience changes that alter their growth and distribution, affecting the availability of energy for those above them. As these foundational levels shift, the impact moves upward, influencing predators and the relationships that connect them. The structure of the ecosystem, built over long periods of stability, begins to lose its coherence. Regions of the ocean that once supported diverse communities become areas where conditions fluctuate beyond what those communities can tolerate. Oxygen-depleted zones expand, reducing the space in which life can persist. Acidified waters alter the balance of chemical processes, while rising temperatures influence metabolism and behavior. Together, these changes create an environment that differs fundamentally from the one that had sustained life across the Permian seas. The progression of these events marks the beginning of a period in which the system no longer returns to its previous state. The processes driving change continue, each reinforcing the others, creating a sustained departure from earlier conditions. The ocean, once defined by stability, now reflects a convergence of forces that reshape its structure and the life within it. In this convergence, the stage is set for a transformation that extends across the entire system, not as a single moment, but as a continuous unfolding driven by the alignment of multiple changes acting together. The structure of the ocean, once layered with steady connections, begins to loosen in ways that do not immediately appear as absence, but as fragmentation. Relationships that had been maintained across long intervals start to separate, their links weakening as the conditions that supported them continue to shift. What had functioned as a connected system now moves toward disassembly, not through a single break, but through many small failures that accumulate across the whole. At the base of the marine ecosystem, the organisms responsible for sustaining the flow of energy begin to decline in both number and stability. Their populations no longer follow consistent patterns, and their distribution becomes uneven across regions that had once shared similar conditions. These changes reduce the foundation upon which higher levels depend, altering the balance that had allowed the system to operate with continuity. As this foundation weakens, the effects extend upward through the food web. Species that rely on these organisms encounter increasing difficulty in maintaining their own populations. The reduction in available resources forces adjustments that cannot always compensate for the loss. Some species decline gradually, while others disappear from regions where they had once been present, leaving gaps that are not immediately filled. The breakdown of these connections leads to a wider pattern of loss. Marine ecosystems, once structured through layers of interaction, begin to lose their coherence as species disappear at different levels. The absence of one group influences the survival of others, creating a chain of effects that spreads through the system. This process does not occur uniformly, but it moves through the ocean in waves, affecting different regions with varying intensity. Habitats themselves begin to change as the conditions that define them are altered. Areas that once supported diverse communities become less capable of sustaining life in the same way. Chemical shifts, reduced oxygen levels, and altered circulation patterns combine to create environments that differ fundamentally from their previous state. These changes limit the range of conditions under which organisms can survive, reducing the space available for them to exist. For predators, the loss of prey becomes a defining factor. The organisms that once formed the basis of their feeding strategies decline in number or shift to areas that are no longer accessible. The pathways through which energy moved become disrupted, leaving fewer opportunities to sustain the same level of activity. The feeding systems that had operated with efficiency now encounter increasing difficulty as the alignment between structure and environment breaks down. This process extends beyond individual species, affecting the overall diversity of life within the ocean. The number of species decreases as more are unable to adapt to the changing conditions. The variety of forms, once shaped by long periods of stability, gives way to a more limited set of survivors. The ecosystem, once rich in complexity, becomes simplified as connections are lost and replaced by fewer, more constrained interactions. The collapse of the ancient seas unfolds as a continuous sequence rather than a single event. Each loss contributes to the next, reinforcing a pattern that moves through the system without returning to its previous state. The ocean, still vast in scale, carries within it a reduced structure, one where the layers that once supported life have been diminished. In this transformation, the balance that had defined the Permian seas gives way to a different condition, one marked not by stability, but by the absence of the connections that once held the system together. At a certain point in the geological record, the spiral no longer appears. Layers that once carried its form, repeating across different regions and intervals, give way to strata where it is absent. The transition is not marked by gradual reduction in detail or variation in shape, but by a sudden absence that stands in contrast to its long continuity. Where it had been present again and again, it now does not return. This absence aligns with a broader boundary preserved within the rock, a point where many forms that had persisted across the Permian period no longer continue into the layers above. The spiral, consistent in its structure through millions of years, does not extend beyond this division. Its record ends alongside numerous other species, each reflecting a system that had been reshaped in ways that no longer supported their survival. The lack of continuation is not explained by a single missing discovery, but by a consistent pattern across locations. In regions where the spiral had been found before, the layers above the boundary show no trace of it. The same absence appears in deposits separated by great distances, reinforcing the conclusion that the organism did not persist beyond this point. Its presence, once widespread, resolves into a final occurrence that does not repeat. Within the context of the changes that had been unfolding, this disappearance reflects the limits of its design. The feeding system, shaped for a specific alignment with its environment, encountered conditions that no longer matched those requirements. The prey it depended on had declined or shifted, the habitats that supported its movement had altered, and the stability that had allowed its specialization to function had been replaced by variability and loss. A structure that once provided efficiency now faced conditions in which that efficiency could not be maintained. The spiral, with its inward guiding motion and continuous sequence of teeth, remained unchanged in its form, yet the interactions it depended on were no longer available in the same way. The environment had moved beyond the range in which its design could operate effectively, leaving it without the resources needed to sustain itself. Generalist organisms, with broader feeding strategies, may have found ways to persist by shifting between available resources, but a system built on specialization does not easily adjust. The same precision that had allowed the spiral to function within a stable niche limited its ability to respond to the rapid and widespread changes that defined this period. Its design, once aligned with its environment, became increasingly disconnected from the conditions that now prevailed. The disappearance of the spiral does not leave behind a transitional form that adapts its structure to the new environment. Instead, it marks the end of a lineage that had followed a distinct path. The fossil record preserves its presence up to a point, and then, with the same clarity, records its absence beyond it. There is no continuation, no gradual modification that bridges the gap between the conditions before and after. In this way, the spiral becomes part of a larger pattern, one in which many forms that had persisted through long periods of stability come to an end as the system changes beyond their capacity to adapt. Its disappearance reflects not a failure of the structure itself, but a shift in the environment that removed the conditions under which that structure could function. What remains is the record of its existence, preserved in the layers where it once appeared, and the clear boundary beyond which it does not return, marking the conclusion of a form shaped by a world that no longer exists. After the boundary is crossed, the ocean does not return to what it had been, nor does it rebuild its former patterns in the same arrangement. What follows is a period shaped less by continuity and more by selection under new constraints. The system that emerges is not a restoration, but a reconfiguration, where survival depends on different conditions than those that had once allowed specialized forms to persist. In the aftermath, ecosystems begin to reorganize around organisms that can tolerate variation rather than depend on stability. The environment, still influenced by the processes that disrupted it, does not immediately settle into a consistent state. Fluctuations remain, and within them, forms that can adjust to changing conditions find a greater advantage. Adaptability becomes a defining feature, not as an added trait, but as a requirement for persistence within a system that no longer offers predictable support. Feeding strategies reflect this shift. Mechanisms that rely on precise alignment with specific prey become less effective in a landscape where availability changes over shorter intervals. In their place, simpler systems begin to dominate, not because they are more refined, but because they are more flexible. Jaws that can grip, tear, or crush a variety of materials allow organisms to move between different sources of food, maintaining continuity even as individual prey types fluctuate. These strategies do not require the same degree of specialization that once defined earlier forms. They operate across a broader range of conditions, allowing survival in environments where predictability has diminished. The efficiency gained through specialization is replaced by a different kind of stability, one that arises from the ability to adapt rather than the ability to match a specific niche. Within this context, structures like the spiral do not reappear. The conditions that once supported such a precise and narrowly aligned system are no longer present in the same form. The pathways that allowed it to function effectively have been altered, and the evolutionary pressures that follow favor designs that can accommodate change rather than depend on consistency. The absence of the spiral is not a gap waiting to be filled, but a reflection of a shift in the direction of development. Evolution continues, exploring new forms and strategies, yet the extremes that characterized earlier periods become less common. The system now filters possibilities through a different set of constraints, limiting the emergence of structures that require stable conditions to function. This does not reduce the diversity of life, but it reshapes it, guiding it toward forms that balance function with flexibility. Over time, the ocean fills again with movement and interaction, yet the patterns differ from those that came before. The relationships between species, the flow of energy, and the structures that support feeding all reflect the new conditions under which they developed. The absence of certain forms becomes part of this pattern, marking the difference between what was possible before and what is sustained afterward. In this reconfigured system, the memory of earlier designs remains only in the record preserved within stone. The spiral, once integrated into a stable network of interactions, does not find a place within the new arrangement. Its absence is not replaced by a direct counterpart, but by a range of forms that follow different paths, shaped by the demands of an environment that no longer supports such precise specialization. The ocean continues, carrying forward new expressions of life, while leaving behind those that belonged to a different set of conditions, defined by a balance that no longer exists. Not everything left behind carries the same clarity. Even with the accumulation of specimens and the refinement of methods, there remain spaces within the record where information does not resolve into a complete picture. The preserved spiral, precise in its structure, offers insight into form and function, yet beyond it, many aspects of the organism's life remain only partially traced, existing at the edge of what evidence can reveal. Behavior, in particular, leaves only indirect traces. Movement through water, interactions with others of its kind, and patterns of daily activity do not fossilize in a way that can be read directly. These elements must be inferred from structure and environment, from the shape of the body and the conditions in which it existed. Such inferences, while grounded in evidence, cannot fully capture the range of actions that defined its presence within the ancient seas. The life cycle presents a similar challenge. Growth can be observed in the gradual addition of material within the spiral, a record of development that unfolds through the layering of teeth. Yet the stages that surround this growth, from early development to maturity, are not preserved with the same continuity. The transition from juvenile to adult, the rate at which this process occurred, and the duration of its life remain aspects that can only be approached through comparison and estimation. Reproduction extends further into uncertainty. The mechanisms by which new individuals were produced, whether through eggs, live birth, or another method, are not directly recorded. Soft tissues associated with reproductive structures rarely persist in the fossil record, and without them, the process remains beyond clear observation. Clues may be drawn from related groups, from organisms that share broader characteristics, yet these connections do not provide a definitive answer for this particular form. Even the broader context in which these processes occurred carries limitations. The environment, reconstructed through chemical signals and associated fossils, offers a framework within which the organism existed. However, the precise interactions within that environment, the timing of events, and the variability from one region to another introduce layers of complexity that cannot be fully resolved. Each piece of evidence contributes to an understanding, yet the overall picture retains areas where detail fades. The fossil record itself, while extensive, is selective. Conditions required for preservation occur only under specific circumstances, leaving many moments unrecorded. Organisms that lived and died outside these conditions may leave no trace, and even those that are preserved represent only a fraction of their existence. What remains is a series of snapshots, each one capturing a particular moment, separated by intervals that cannot be directly observed. Within these gaps, interpretation plays a role, guided by evidence but shaped by the limits of what can be known. Scientific understanding advances through the integration of new discoveries and methods, refining earlier interpretations and introducing new perspectives. Yet each refinement also highlights the boundaries of certainty, revealing where knowledge ends and possibility begins. The spiral, clear in its geometry, stands alongside these uncertainties, a structure that can be examined in detail while the life that produced it remains partially hidden. Its presence offers a window into a past that is both accessible and distant, where certain aspects can be reconstructed with confidence and others remain beyond direct reach. In this balance between clarity and absence, the story of the organism continues to unfold, shaped by what is preserved and defined by what is not, reflecting the nature of a record that captures fragments of a much larger and more complex whole. Recognition often depends on patterns that feel consistent with what has been seen before. Forms that align with familiar structures are easier to place within an existing sense of how life is arranged, their features fitting into expectations shaped by observation across the present world. When a structure does not align with those patterns, it creates a different kind of response, one that is not defined by absence alone, but by the difficulty of relating it to anything known. The spiral stands within this space. Its arrangement does not follow the lines typically associated with jaws or teeth. There is no clear separation into rows, no visible symmetry that suggests a simple opening and closing motion. Instead, the structure curves inward in a continuous progression, each tooth positioned as part of a sequence that extends beyond the immediate surface. The pattern does not present itself as a variation of a known form, but as something that follows a different set of principles. Human perception tends to group features into categories, drawing connections between shapes that share common elements. Teeth are expected to line edges, to form boundaries that define where a mouth begins and ends. Jaws are expected to hinge, to operate through movements that can be easily visualized. The spiral does not fit into these categories, and as a result, it resists immediate interpretation. It does not suggest its function in the same way, requiring a different kind of reasoning to understand how it might operate. This unfamiliarity is reinforced by the precision of its geometry. The curve is not irregular or loosely arranged, but tightly organized, each element following a consistent path. The regularity gives it a quality that appears deliberate, as though shaped according to a pattern that extends beyond organic variation. This impression does not arise from actual design, but from the way the structure aligns with patterns often associated with mechanical systems, where repetition and precision are expected. Evolution, however, does not distinguish between forms that appear organic and those that resemble constructed systems. It operates through gradual changes that are preserved when they function effectively within a given environment. Over time, these changes can produce structures that, while entirely natural in origin, align with patterns that seem more structured than expected. The spiral emerges from this process, its form shaped by the requirements of function rather than by any adherence to familiar appearance. The sense of unfamiliarity also reflects the distance between present experience and the conditions under which the structure developed. The environments that shaped it, the interactions that defined its role, and the organisms it encountered differ from those observed today. Without direct comparison, the mind relies on existing references, and when those references do not align, the result is a form that feels difficult to place within a known framework. Even with an understanding of its function, the visual impression remains distinct. Knowing how the spiral operated does not fully align it with familiar forms, because its structure continues to follow a pattern that is not commonly seen. The difference is not resolved through explanation alone, but remains as part of the way the structure is perceived. In this way, the spiral occupies a position where knowledge and perception do not fully converge. It can be understood in terms of function and context, yet still appears separate from the patterns that define most expectations of life. This separation does not indicate that it is outside the processes that shape living forms, but rather that those processes are capable of producing outcomes that extend beyond what is commonly anticipated. The result is a structure that continues to feel unfamiliar, not because it lacks explanation, but because it reflects a range of possibilities within evolution that are not often encountered, reminding that the boundaries of form are wider than the patterns that are most easily recognized. There is a tendency to expect continuity in the shapes life takes, to imagine that the forms seen today represent a steady refinement toward familiarity. Yet the record beneath the surface suggests something broader, a process that does not move in a straight line, but expands outward through countless variations, many of which do not resemble anything that persists into the present. Within that wider pattern, the spiral stands as a trace of a path that unfolded fully, then came to an end. Its structure, once part of a functioning system, reflects how evolution operates through opportunity rather than intention. When conditions allow, forms can emerge that align with very specific roles, shaped by interactions that remain stable long enough for refinement to occur. The spiral did not need to resemble other feeding systems, nor did it need to follow patterns that would later become common. It existed because, for a time, its design matched the environment in which it developed. This perspective shifts how the past is understood. Rather than viewing extinct forms as incomplete versions of what exists now, they can be seen as complete in their own context, fully adapted to conditions that no longer remain. The unfamiliarity they present is not a sign of error or inefficiency, but a reflection of how diverse the outcomes of evolution can be when shaped by different environments. The ocean, across its long history, has provided a setting where such variation can take form. Its scale, its depth, and its changing conditions create a space where new structures can emerge, interact, and persist for extended periods. Within this setting, forms appear that do not fit within later expectations, yet function effectively within their own time. The spiral belongs to this continuum, one expression among many that arose within a system defined by constant change. Looking back through this record, the boundaries of what is considered typical begin to soften. The patterns recognized in modern life represent only a portion of what has existed, shaped by the survivors of past transitions rather than the full range of possibilities. The absence of certain forms today does not diminish their significance, but highlights how much of that range has been filtered through events that reshaped the course of life. There remains, within this understanding, an awareness of how much cannot be fully recovered. Each discovery adds detail, yet also reveals the extent of what has been lost to time. The fragments that remain offer insight, but they do not reconstruct every aspect of the systems they once belonged to. This incomplete record invites continued exploration, not as a search for a final answer, but as an ongoing process of refinement and discovery. The spiral, preserved in stone, continues to prompt this process. It draws attention not through familiarity, but through its difference, encouraging a closer examination of how life can take forms that extend beyond expectation. In doing so, it becomes part of a broader reflection on the history of the planet, where each layer carries traces of worlds that operated under different conditions. If this journey through that history has left a lingering sense of curiosity, it can continue to unfold through shared observation and discussion. Thoughts, interpretations, and questions can move beyond the record itself, connecting perspectives in ways that extend the exploration further. And for those who find a certain calm in these slow passages through deep time, there is always more to uncover, more stories shaped by the same quiet, expansive processes that have carried life forward across the ages.